Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Lead Mask of Vintém Hill. Introduction. On a late winter afternoon in August 1966, on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a young boy wandered up the slopes of Morro do Vintém Hill. Flying his kite in the gentle breeze, the hill was a quiet, green elevation near the city of Niterói, offering views over the bay and the distant bustle of Rio. It was usually a peaceful place, a spot for local children to play and occasional hikers. But on this day, the boy's carefree adventure took a chilling turn. As he chased after his kite along the scrubby hilltop, he stumbled upon a sight that would haunt him forever. Two bodies lying motionless in the grass. Startled and frightened, the boy ran back down to notify the authorities of what he had seen. Evening was approaching, and a light rain had begun to fall over Niterói. When the police received the report of bodies on Vintém Hill, they realized reaching the site would not be easy. The terrain was steep and overgrown, and daylight was fading. Due to the rough conditions and the onset of bad weather, the initial responding officers decided to postpone the retrieval until the following day. All through that night, the hill remained dark and silent, guarding the secret of the two unknown men who lay side by side in the grass under the falling rain. Chapter 1. A perplexing scene. It was not until the morning of August 21st, 1966, that a team of police officers, firefighters, and reporters managed to scale Vintém Hill and arrive at the remote spot near its summit. The trek was arduous. The slopes were slick from rain and covered in dense vegetation. After more than 2 hours of careful climbing, the group emerged into a small clearing, roughly 10 square meters, at the very top of the hill. There, exactly as the boy had described, lay the bodies of 2 adult men. As the investigators cautiously approached, the bizarre nature of the scene became apparent in unsettling detail. The 2 men were lying on their backs, parallel to one another. They were both dressed in identical attire, neat, matching formal suits of dark color, each topped with a waterproof raincoat. These outfits might not have been out of place for businessmen or technicians of the era, yet seeing them worn in this remote hillside location was striking. Even more perplexing were the peculiar objects covering the men's faces. Each man wore a mask over his eyes, but not an ordinary mask. These were homemade eye coverings crafted from solid lead. Shaped roughly like the eye shields of sunglasses, but without any arm pieces, the gray metal pieces completely obscured the eyes of the deceased. The rest of their faces were uncovered, giving the eerie impression of lead blindfolds. Later analysis would indicate the masks had been cut from crude sheets of lead or lead pipe, hand-fashioned into oval eye patches. They had no glass or openings. If the men had been alive wearing them, they would have been effectively blinded. The purpose of these heavy masks were not immediately clear to the police, adding to the growing sense of mystery. Surveying the scene further, investigators found no obvious signs of trauma on the bodies. There were no gunshot wound, no stab marks, no blood except for minor traces around the men's noses and mouths. The corpses were already in a state of moderate decomposition. It had been several days since death, but there were no indications of a struggle. The clearing itself did not show disturbed earth or broken vegetation that might signal a fight or violent incident. In fact, beneath the bodies was a bed of freshly cut palm leaves arranged on the ground. These leaves, from a wild palm known locally as pendoba, formed a kind of mat under each man, as if someone had prepared a place for them to lie down. Oddly, no knife or cutting tool was found at the scene, even though such tough palm fronds would normally require a blade to cut. How the leaves had been harvested and placed there remained another unanswered question. Nearby, the searchers discovered a collection of objects that deepened the mystery. An empty bottle that had once held mineral water was lying in the grass, along with a package containing 2 wet towels. Intriguingly, they also found makeshift aluminum foil cups, little crudely shaped bowl-like pieces fashioned from aluminum, as if the men had shaped foil into vessels. Scattered around were several torn pieces of paper. On one small notepad page, the investigators found something that made their hearts skip. A set of handwritten instructions, cryptic and unnerving. The note, written in Portuguese, read, 1630, be at the agreed place. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, await signal, mask. The broken phrasing and lack of punctuation left some room for interpretation, but its meaning was unmistakably bizarre. It appeared to be a set of timed directives, as if outlining a ritual or procedure the men had intended to carry out on the hill. Arrive by 4:30 in the afternoon. Take some capsules at 6:30. Then once the capsules take effect, protect metals, wait for a signal, and put on masks. Here, on this lonely hilltop, it seemed these 2 men have followed these instructions to a fatal end. Another slip of paper recovered from one of the bodies contained a list of chemical formulas and electronic equations, perhaps scribbled calculations or references to their technical work. Yet another piece had a jumbled series of letters and numbers, resembling some kind of code. There was also a page filled with what looked like a schedule of doses, notes about taking one capsule on certain days: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, as if the men had been following a multi-day regimen leading up to this final moment. One dirty scrap of paper even had the single word bonsai scrawled on it in pencil, the Japanese exclamation meaning hurrah or a battle cry, a seemingly random inclusion that would later puzzle investigators. Beyond these notes in the bottle, other personal items were found with the bodies. One man had a wedding ring tied to a reading eyeglass tucked in his jacket, as if he had removed them and secured them together. One of the pair had also taken off his wristwatch and placed it in his pocket. Indeed, both men's watches and any jewelry had been removed and stowed away safely. In one of the pockets, the police found a plastic bag containing a wad of cash, a considerable sum of Brazilian currency, wrapped to keep it dry. However, tellingly, this cash amounted to only a few hundred cruzeiros, Brazil's currency at the time, a fraction of what the men were known to have carried when they departed on their journey. The rest of their money was missing. As the morning sun climbed higher, the recovery team carefully cataloged these findings, all the while confronted with more questions than answers. Who were these two men? Why had they come to this remote spot, dressed in business suits and lead eye masks? What was the meaning of the cryptic note about capsules and signals? And most pressingly, what had caused their deaths? Chapter 2. Identifying the men. The first clue to the mystery men's identities came from the documents found on them. Each carried personal identification papers, as was standard in Brazil, and thanks to these, the police quickly identified the victims as Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana. Both were relatively young, in their early 30s, and as it turns out, they were friends and colleagues. Each man was an electronics technician by trade, and they hailed from the same town, far to the north of Rio, a place called Campos dos Goitacazes in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Campos, as it's often shortened, was known as a prosperous agricultural and industrial town, and it lay several hundred kilometers from the capital city. Digging further, investigators learned that Manuel, age 32, and Miguel, age 34, ran a small electronics and television repair shop together in Campos. They were skilled tinkerers, part of a new generation of self-made technical experts in 1960s Brazil, in an era when television sets and radios were becoming common in households. The knowledge to fix such devices was valuable. By all accounts, the two men were respected in their community and had a keen interest in advancing their technical skills. Miguel, in particular, had sought education beyond his hometown. He had even taken a correspondence course in electronics from an institute in Los Angeles years earlier, demonstrating both curiosity and ambition. Both men were married. Miguel's wife was named Elsa, and Manuel's wife was named Nellie, and they had stable family lives. Nothing in their background immediately marked them as the type of people who would be involved in anything illicit or bizarre. Yet here they were, found dead under extraordinary circumstances. According to statements later taken from their families, Manuel and Miguel had left Campos dos Goitacazes on August 17, 1966, just a few days before the discovery of their bodies. They had told their wives and relatives that they were going on a work trip. Specifically, they claimed they were heading to Sao Paulo, Brazil's industrial metropolis, to purchase some used electronic equipment in a car for their shop's business. This explanation seemed plausible enough at the time. Sao Paulo was indeed the kind of place one might find good deals on technical instruments or second-hand vehicles, and the journey from Campos to Sao Paulo, though long, would not be unusual for enterprising tradesmen. With this plan in mind, the two men had packed a substantial amount of cash for their shopping. Estimates vary, but witnesses recalled them carrying somewhere between 2 and 3 million cruzeiros, a small fortune in 1966, equivalent to many months' wages for a working man. They also carried lists of components friends had requested them to buy in the big city, and they prepared for a road trip, even packing a couple of towels among their belongings for the journey. On the morning of August 17th, Manuel Pereira de Cruz woke early. Before dawn, he roused his wife Nellie from sleep to remind her that he and Miguel would be leaving first thing in the morning for their trip. He was enthusiastic and emphasized the importance of what they were going to do. "We need a car to better serve our customers," he told her, explaining why they were going to Sao Paulo. He added a curious line which Nellie later recounted. Manuel said, "Miguel and I have to do an important experiment. After I return, I will tell you whether I believe in it or not." At this time, this statement seemed cryptic to her. What experiment was he talking about? Perhaps it was just a figure of speech about testing a used car or some new equipment. She could not have imagined its more literal and ominous significance. Around 9 a.m. that day, a friend named Alucio Batista Azevedo drove the pair to the bus station in Campos. They bought tickets for the southbound coach. Interestingly, although they had told everyone they were bound for Sao Paulo, the bus tickets they purchased were not for Sao Paulo line at all. They were one-way tickets to Niterói, the city across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. Perhaps Manuel and Miguel had a change of plans they hadn't revealed, or perhaps Sao Paulo had been a ruse from the beginning. At the bus station just before departure, another familiar face turned up. Alcio Correia Gomez, a friend of theirs from the electronic shop, was there to see them off. Alicio was a slightly younger man who often hung around their shop, eager to learn from Miguel and Manoel's expertise. By some accounts, Alicio had even received informal electronics training from Miguel, almost like an apprenticeship. He was also known to share the two men's interest in the metaphysical, something that would become important later. Lucio later reported that nothing seemed particularly amiss in the men's demeanor at the bus station that morning. They carried a few bags and that hefty sum of cash, but otherwise appeared simply prepared for a professional trip. With final handshakes and goodbyes, Miguel and Manoel boarded the bus. Their assigned seats were numbered 25 and 26. The bus pulled out of Campos and began the roughly 3 to 4 hour journey southward. Unknown to their families, the two technicians were not heading to the laboratories and auto shops of Sao Paulo, but toward a far stranger fate awaiting in Niterói. Chapter 3. The Path to the Hill. The bus ride south would have taken the men through the green countryside of Rio de Janeiro state, likely filled with nervous anticipation. They arrived around 2 p.m. on that very day, August 17th, 1966. Niterói, located just across the Guanabara Bay from the city of Rio, was a smaller city with a relaxed pace. It was drizzling when they arrived. A light rain fell over the streets. Stepping off the bus, Miguel and Manoel found themselves in an unfamiliar city, carrying a large sum of money. If they had any prearranged plans or contacts, those were not immediately obvious, but subsequent events suggest they might indeed have had an itinerary in mind. Their first recorded shop was an electronics shop called Fluoscope, located at 13 Alberto Verdor Street, not far from the bus station. The shop was a retailer of radio and television parts. The owner, Hernani Teixeira de Carvalho Ferro, later recalled the encounter to police. Just 4 days earlier, Hernani had coincidentally met Miguel and Manoel up in Campos. They had discussed electronic components and a particular advertisement for an expensive AM/FM frequency generator that Miguel had been interested in. Now, here were the two Campos technicians in Hernani's own store. They greeted him and inquired about some specific Philips brand electronic components. Hernani was somewhat puzzled. The parts they asked for were not common stock items, especially not outside major markets like Sao Paulo. As a seasoned electronics dealer, Hernani found it a bit odd that Miguel and Manoel, both experienced technicians, would expect to find such rare components in Niterói. He politely informed them that he had none of those items available. Despite this minor setback, the two friends did not seem discouraged. They chatted amiably with Hernani about their continuing journey. Before departing the shop, They even extended an invitation. Would Hernani like to join them for a trip to Sao Paulo in the coming days to help find these components? Perhaps they were still maintaining a facade about going to Sao Paulo, or perhaps they genuinely intended to head there after a short stop. In any case, Hernani declined the offer, being busy with his own affairs. During their visit, 2 other individuals happened to be present, a store employee and a taxi driver. Both later verified that nothing appeared abnormal about Miguel and Manuel's behavior. They seemed calm, professional, and in a bit of a hurry to get on with their tasks. After leaving the electronics store, the next documented stop came at around 2:45 p.m. Miguel and Manuel visited Casa Brasila, a shop specializing in plastics, rubber goods, and assorted homewares, located on Coronel Gomez Machado Street. Here, they made a practical purchase. Given the day's wet weather, each bought a new waterproof raincoat. The coat costs 9,400 cruceros apiece, as indicated by receipts later found in their pockets. Oddly, despite the ongoing rain, the men didn't actually put the raincoats on after buying them. They hurried out of the store with the coats still in their packaging, which struck a witness as strange. According to later police speculation, the pair's demeanor had shifted since the electronics store. They appeared more agitated and rushed by the time they bought the rain gear. This raised the possibility that something or someone had intervened in the interim between these stops to make them anxious or pressed for time. Receipts in hand for the raincoats, the duo continued on. By around 3:15 p.m., they arrived at a modest establishment known as Barri Merceria São Jorge, a bar and convenience store near the foot of Vintém Hill. The São Jorge bar was a humble, local place where residents could grab a quick bite or a bottle of something to drink. Here, Miguel and Manuel's actions were later recounted by the bar owner's daughter, Maria de Lourdes, who served them. They ordered a bottle of mineral water, specifically requesting that it be very cold. Maria handed them 1-liter glass bottle of chilled water. The men, although in a hurry by her impression, insisted on paying a deposit and taking the receipt for the bottle. In Brazil at that time, it was common to pay a small deposit for glass bottles, refundable upon returning the empty bottle. The deposit was only about 300 cruzeiro, a trivial amount, but the men clearly intended to get that money back later by returning the empty. This tiny detail, the act of waiting to receive a receipt for the bottle refund, will later stand out to investigators. It suggested that whatever mission the men were on, they believed they would come back to that bar eventually to reclaim a few coins. In other words, they did not see this journey as a one-way trip or a suicide mission at all. Bottle of cold water and new raincoats in hand, Miguel and Manuel then set off towards Vintém Hill itself. The base of the hill was accessible via the end of Rue Andrada Pinto, a street that climbed partway up before giving way to footpath. They likely walked or perhaps caught a short ride to the end of that strait, arriving there sometime after 3:15 p.m. Locals would later say that multiple informal footpaths led up Vintém Hill. It wasn't a developed park with a single trail, but rather a wild hill with several tracks trodden by residents or adventurous children. It's unclear which path the two men took, but at that point, they began their ascent. The climb even today is not an easy one. The hill is steep and covered in brush. One can imagine the two technicians in their suits and carrying possibly a bag or bundle containing the raincoats, towels, and whatever else they brought, carefully making their way upward. The day was still overcast, the ground damp. If they followed the instructions later found in their note, their goal was to reach a specific determined place by 4:30 p.m. Indeed, based on estimates and later reconstructions, reaching the top might have taken them about an hour on foot from the bar. By around 4:30 p.m. that day, August 17th, it's likely that Manuel and Miguel stood on the summit of Morro do Vintém, at the very clearing where their bodies would be discovered. Whether they met anyone there or were alone remains one of the unknown facets of the story. Some evidence would later suggest they might not have been the only people on the hill that evening. Chapter 4. An Unseen Encounter. As twilight neared on August 17, 1966, something unusual was reportedly seen in the skies above Niterói. A local woman named Crescenda Barbosa Guccinho was driving through the area around Vintém Hill with her 3 children, approximately 7 p.m. This would have been about an hour and a half after the men were supposed to ingest their capsules, if the note's timeline was being followed. Crescenda's children first noticed lights hovering above the hill, prompting her to stop the car for a better look. For a few minutes, the family gazed upward at a remarkable sight, a bright, oval-shaped object with an orange glow, surrounded by a halo or ring of fire. The mysterious airborne object emitted blue beams of light that shot out in many directions. It moved silently, bobbing up and down in the sky over the vicinity of Vintém Hill. Crescenda later described it as unlike any conventional aircraft she knew. In fact, it looked to her like a UFO. After observing it in awe for several minutes, Crescenda hurried home, unsettled by the experience. She told her husband Paulo what they had seen. Intrigued, Paulo immediately went out to the area to see if the object was still there. But by the time he arrived, the strange lights were gone. Unsure of how to explain what they had witnessed, and perhaps wary of ridicule, the couple initially told no one about the incident. It is tempting to draw a connection between this UFO sighting and the presence of Manuel and Miguel on the hill that night. The timing and location match. A glowing oval object was seen above the very hill where, likely at that same moment, the 2 men lay on the ground, possibly waiting for a signal. Did the men also see this extraordinary light? Had they been waiting for this very phenomenon as a sign? Or was it a coincidental event unrelated to their fate. These questions would emerge in the days following the tragedy, once Griselda and others came forward with their accounts of unusual aerial lights on that evening. For now, however, on August 17th, no public knowledge of the UFO sighting existed. It was just a quiet, bewildering memory carried by one family as they went to bed that night. What happened on the hilltop in the final moments of Manuel and Miguel's lives can only be imagined. The instructions they had written suggest a plan meticulously, if oddly, laid out. Sometime around 6:30 p.m., as dusk settled, they presumably consumed the capsules they had brought. Whether those capsules contained a strong sedative, a hallucinogen, or something else entirely, we do not know. The note's phrasing, after the effect, protect metals, await signal, mask, implies that once they felt the substance taking hold in their system, they were to do two things: protect metals and await signal, mask. The interpretation of protect metals remains one of the strangest pieces of this puzzle. One plausible reading is that they believed the upcoming experience, whether contacting spirits, being exposed to radiation, or encountering an intense energy, might adversely affect metal objects on their person. Perhaps they thought that a powerful electromagnetic field or a burst of supernatural light could damage or magnetize metal items. Thus, to protect their metallic belongings, they removed them. This aligns with the fact that Miguel's watch and wedding rings were found wrapped together inside his clothing, and presumably Manuel had also stashed away any metal he carried. It is as if they wanted to shield or simply take off anything metal before whatever was going to happen occurred. The next part, await signal, mask, suggests that they were expecting some sign, perhaps a visual sign in the sky or an auditory cue, at which point they should put on the lead masks over their eyes. If indeed they anticipated encountering a blinding light or some radiant phenomenon, like the approach of an extraterrestrial ship or a burst of spiritual energy, the lead masks might have been intended as protective goggles to shield their vision from overwhelming brilliance or dangerous rays. Lead is known for blocking certain types of radiation, and in folk science, it might also be thought to block intense light. One theory later proposed was that they might have expected to see a dazzling apparition or flash and didn't want to be blinded by it. So following their note, they donned the heavy opaque masks to cover their eyes once everything was in place, and they awaited the signal. And so, in the dark of that Wednesday evening, it seems likely that Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana followed the plan to its end. They laid out palm leaves, perhaps to insulate themselves from the damp ground, or as a ritual bedding, removed their watches and rings, and donned their lead masks over their eyes. The cold mineral water they had purchased might have been used to swallow the capsules or wash them down. The presence of the wet towels could indicate they anticipated perspiring or needing to cool themselves, a common effect when ingesting certain drugs, or perhaps to wipe their faces if something irritated them. The improvised aluminum foil cups could have held additional substances. Maybe they dissolved a powder or poured a liquid to drink, or mixed the capsules with water to administer the dose. At some point, under the silent sky, the two friends lost consciousness, and their lives ebbed away. Whether it was peaceful drift into oblivion or an agonizing process, no one can say for sure. There were slight traces of blood on their faces, suggesting maybe some internal bleeding or lung edema, as can often happen with certain poisonings. But they did not move from where they lay. There was no sign either had tried to crawl or stagger for help. It was as if, after completing their tasks, they simply lay back side by side and awaited whatever fate was in store. For 2 days, their bodies remained undiscovered at the top of Vintém Hill, exposed to the elements. Light rain fell on them intermittently, and the tropical warmth of August, which is winter in Brazil but mild, would have accelerated decomposition. Birds and insects of the hillside went about their natural processes, oblivious to the human drama that had unfolded. On August 18th, a local boy hunting small wild animals on the hill came across the eerie scene. He saw the two figures lying on the leaves and initially thought perhaps they were just sleeping or passed out. Uneasy, he reported it to a nearby resident, who happened to be an off-duty policeman living in the neighborhood at the base of the hill. For reasons unclear, perhaps the officer assumed the pair were drunk or homeless men sleeping off a hangover, and he didn't want to get involved. That early warning was disregarded. No action was taken on the 18th or 19th. Meanwhile, families back in Campos were growing worried. Miguel and Manoel had not returned from their Sao Paulo trip on schedule, and no word had come. Their loved ones did not know that an unrelated child's kite on August 20th would finally bring the secret to light. When the police finally did reach the bodies on August 21st, as we have seen, they documented everything they found in meticulous detail. The scene perplexed even seasoned investigators. Photographs were taken of the bodies, 2 raincoat-clad forms in the grass with those metallic patches over their eyes. The lead masks were collected as evidence, along with the notes and all other items. The story quickly hit the Brazilian news cycle, astounding the public with its strangeness. Early headlines dubbed it "The Mystery of the Lead Masks," and the case began to be called O Mistério das Máscaras de Campos in Portuguese. The notion of 2 apparently ordinary men dying in such a strange fashion invited endless speculation. Chapter 5: Investigation and Autopsy Woes. With Manuel and Miguel identified, the case became both a criminal investigation and a medical mystery. The bodies were transported down the hill and taken to the coroner's office for autopsy to determine the cause of death. However, fate dealt the investigation another bad hand. The city morgue in Niterói was, at that time, severely overburdened with work. In fact, on the same day the bodies were recovered, August 21st, a high-profile case was also competing for the coroner's attention. An important police detective from Rio had been murdered, and his autopsy took priority. Short on staff and resources, the coroner's office did not immediately begin thorough examination of the two mystery men. Instead, one of the coroner's assistants took charge of preparing the bodies, which involved removing and preserving the internal organs for toxicological testing, and then the bodies were stored awaiting a full autopsy by a medical examiner. Days turned into weeks as the bureaucracy and workload slowed progress. By the time a proper autopsy was performed on Manuel and Miguel, a significant amount of time had elapsed. Accounts suggested it may have been well over a week, perhaps even into early September, due to the backlog. In the interim, the internal organs that had been removed were simply kept in jars on a shelf, inadequately refrigerated. The hot Brazilian weather and lack of proper chemical preservation meant that by the time a toxicologist or pathologist was available to analyze them, the organs had decomposed beyond usability. Vital chemical tests that might have identified poison or drugs in their system were never done, either because the samples were no longer viable or because the coroner's office lacked the necessary reagents and equipment at the time. It was a devastating blow to the case. The official autopsy report, when finally issued, noted no signs of physical trauma and declared the cause of death as indeterminate due to the advanced decomposition and failure to test for toxins. This unfortunate delay effectively shut the door on a definitive medical explanation. If Manuel and Miguel had indeed died from ingesting some kind of toxic capsules or overdose, the proof of it likely vanished with those neglected organs. The investigators were left to deduce cause of death indirectly through context and other evidence. Faced with a lack of forensic certainty, the police inquiry leaned heavily on detective work, interviewing friends and family, tracing the men's steps, and examining all the odd clues from the scene. They noted how the receipt from the bar corroborated the timeline of the men's last afternoon. The bus tickets found with them, unused tickets from Niterói back to Campos, confirmed that the men had intended to return home after their errand. The presence of those return tickets in their pockets underscored that they had not planned a suicide or permanent disappearance. Investigators also realized that most of the cash the men carried was missing. Only about 161,000 cruceros combined remained on the bodies. 157,000 tucked in Miguel's plastic wrap bundle, and a mere 4,000 with Manuel, an amount drastically less than the 2 million plus they had set out with. Even accounting for the expenses of the trip, bus fares, raincoats, water, this was nowhere near the millions of cruceros known to have been in their possession. the substantial shortfall raised suspicions. Had someone taken advantage of them and stolen the money? If foul play was involved, robbery could have been a motive. The note with the coded letters and numbers was soon deciphered by colleagues in the electronics community. It turned out not to be a secret cipher of espionage or mysticism at all, but a shopping list of sorts. Each alphanumeric string corresponded to a model number of an electronic component. Specifically, vacuum tubes, also known as electronic valves, used in radios or televisions. For example, E16 was a shorthand for a certain radio part, and the group of codes included things like E133, E134, 12AU7, which were standard tube designations. When investigators questioned Elcio the friend, he admitted that he had asked Miguel and Manoel to pick up some replacement valves for him while they were on their trip. Indeed, the trio stop at the electronics store Fluoscope fits this narrative, as they were looking for components there, though seemingly more exotic ones than those codes. That particular slip of paper ended up being a mundane clue, unrelated to the cause of death, but helpful in reconstructing their activities. The sheet with electronic formulas was similarly not very illuminating, except to show the men were working on technical projects. The daily capsule schedule note, however, was deeply intriguing. It indicated that starting Sunday, which would have been August 14th, 1966, some regimen of taking one capsule at specific times was followed. Sunday after a meal, Monday morning while fasting, Tuesday after a meal, and Wednesday when laying down. If Wednesday's capsule was meant to be taken at night when laying down, perhaps precisely the capsule taken atop the hill, then it suggests they had been gradually dosing themselves with something in preparation. Perhaps they built up tolerance or tested the substance in smaller doses prior to the final act. This lends credence to the idea that they planned this as an experiment and were careful enough to do preliminary steps. One detail that would emerge in the investigation is that Miguel and Manoel had actually attempted a similar journey earlier that week. On August 15th, 2 days before they ultimately went to Niterói, they had boarded a bus from Campos, only to turn back midway because Manoel suddenly became ill. They returned home that day, with Manoel complaining he wasn't feeling well enough to travel. It's possible that anxiety or a side effect from the capsule's regimen caused his brief sickness. On the 17th, they tried again and succeeded in reaching Niterói, as we know. This false start hints at the internal trepidation or physical stress one of them was already experiencing as the plan unfolded. Back in Niterói, as the story grabbed headlines, more witnesses and leads came out. Residents living near the base of Vintém Hill reported that on the evening of August 17th, they noticed a group of other people heading up the hill. In particular, a woman whose name wasn't recorded in initial reports claimed she saw a jeep with several men, possibly 5, drive up and park near the hill, and watched a group of these men start climbing the slope around dusk. This struck her as unusual. The hour was late, and the weather not great for a casual hike. Her story was relayed to the police by a man named Raulino de Natos, and the police were eager to find this unnamed woman to get an official report. Could it be that Manuel and Miguel had accomplices or observers with them? Perhaps members of the same clandestine group who left before things went awry? Or could these have been opportunistic robbers who trailed them? Unfortunately, that lead never reached a clear resolution in the available records. The police also combed the area around the hill in the days after, searching for any additional evidence. At one point, they found a small cement pillar or marker embedded in the ground not far from where the bodies lay. It appeared to be a sort of post about a foot tall. Investigators theorized it might have been used as a reference point or meeting location, perhaps to mark the exact specified place mentioned in the note. If someone had prearranged to meet them at a certain marker on the remote hill, that person's identity remained unknown. When the local authorities felt out of their depth with this bizarre case, it drew the attention of higher government agencies. By late August, the inquiry expanded. The federal police, Brazil's National Investigative Force, opened their own case file, and even the secret services of the Army, Navy, and Air Force reportedly became involved. To these agencies, the case raised questions beyond the paranormal. Was there any possibility that this was related to espionage or national security? The mid-1960s were tense times in Brazil. The country was under a military government after a 1964 coup, and Cold War paranoia was pervasive. The fact that the two men had technical backgrounds, that there were coded notes, initially suspicious until deciphered, and that they engaged in secretive experiments could not be ignored. Particularly intriguing was a link to an incident earlier that year involving an explosion on the beach, something that military intelligence unit wanted to understand better, in case it was a covert operation or foreign interference. Chapter 6: A Trail of Experiments and Explosions. As investigators dug into Manuel and Miguel's personal histories, a startling backstory began to emerge. These two electronic technicians had, in the months leading up to their deaths, been involved in a series of curious experiments that went far beyond fixing televisions. It turned out that Manuel, Miguel, and their friend Elcio had an adventurous streak in scientific matters, one that crossed into the realm of the paranormal and the unexplained. One major incident stood out. On the night of May 12, 1966, a full 3 months before the lead mask episode, residents near Atafana Beach, a coastal area about 40 kilometers from Campos, witnessed a dramatic occurrence. At around 9 p.m. that night, a powerful explosion shook the area. Witnesses described seeing a fireball erupt near the beach, a bright flash that lit up the sky, and a thunderous boom audible up to 10 kilometers away. The ground itself trembled from the blast, and windows in nearby houses rattled or shattered. People feared a calamity. Some thought perhaps a small aircraft had crashed, or even that a meteorite had struck offshore. Notably, one local observer recalls seeing a strange illuminated object or ship out at sea shortly before the explosion, and then noted that it disappeared. Rumors quickly spread that maybe a flying saucer had exploded or plunged into the ocean. The Brazilian Navy took notice of this Atafana incident, as any unexplained explosions on the coast could be of interest in terms of security or safety. Naval investigators arrived to check for wreckage or other clues. Meanwhile, a detective from the São João da Barra police, the jurisdiction of Atafana, Walter Fernandes, also independently went to investigate after hearing the blast and feeling his own police station shake. On the dark beach, Detective Fernandez reported encountering a strong odor of sulfur in the air and finding a peculiar set of marks in the sand, a track or groove about 35 centimeters wide and 25 centimeters deep that ran along the beach, looking as if some heavy object or piece of equipment had been dragged or launched. These tracks were mystifying. They did not resemble typical vehicle tire marks. As investigators canvassed for information, an astonishing link came to light. Miguel Viana and Manuel de Cruz had been present on the beach that night. In fact, Miguel, Manuel, and Elcio Gomez were allegedly responsible for that very explosion, not as victims, but as experimenters. According to witnesses, including a shop assistant named Valdir, who was invited along, the three friends had gone to Atafana Beach with the purpose of testing some kind of device or witnessing something supernatural. Valdir later testified that Alcio had been the one to organize this outing, hinting that there would be a spectacle to behold, though he gave scant details beforehand. The four men drove out to the beach at night. Alcio took some equipment or prepared something down on the sand, while others waited at a safe distance. After a short while, Alcio came running back, urging everyone to get in the car and flee immediately. Moments later, the night was torn by the tremendous explosion, a fiery purple-red glow that shot upward, leaving all who saw it stunned. Valdir recalled a pungent sulfur smell hanging in the air as they sped away. Curiously, he did not remember hearing the explosion sound at the moment. Perhaps their distance or the shock dampened it, but the visual and olfactory impression were vivid. This account places our two ill-fated technicians at the center of an earlier mystery. It suggested they were experimenting with some kind of rocketry or explosive device, possibly in hopes of signaling or contacting something above. Indeed, after the news of the lead mask case broke, a weekly magazine in Rio called O Cruzeiro reported that Manuel and Miguel, along with Elcio, had constructed a device in Manuel's own garden prior to Atafana. In June 1966, a homemade contraption assembled in Manuel's backyard apparently detonated accidentally, frightening the family. Manuel's father, Sebastio, even posed for a photograph next to the charred remains of metal pipes and wires in their yard for the magazine article. These scraps were presumably from whatever apparatus the trio had built, perhaps a rudimentary rocket or explosive mechanism. What exactly were these men trying to accomplish with these dangerous trials? One clue lies in something a neighbor overheard a few days before that May explosion. This neighbor, an old friend named Fernando Jose, caught sight of Miguel and Manoel hammering away at a length of lead pipe in a workshop at Manuel's house, likely crafting something related to the device. When he asked out of curiosity what they were doing, the two technicians exchanged glances and then gave a rather grandiose answer. They were working on something that would prevent the end of the world. Pressed further, they elaborated that according to them, a great catastrophe, a cyclone, was prophesied to strike Earth in 1968, and their project would somehow avert this disaster. After that cryptic statement, they refused to say more and resumed their secretive work. This dramatic pronouncement hints that Manuel and Miguel were motivated by apocalyptic or transcendent beliefs. The mid-1960s were indeed rife with doomsday predictions in new religious movements around the world. But this specific mention of a 1968 cataclysm is peculiar. It's unclear where they got this idea of a great cyclone in 1968. Perhaps from a prophetic book or a medium vision. Nevertheless, they seemed to sincerely believe they were agents in some cosmic plan, preparing to save humanity, or at least themselves, from impending doom. Their choice of experiments, launching something into the sky or contacting beyond, aligns with the idea that they might have been attempting to reach out to higher powers or extraterrestrial intelligence to either gain knowledge or seek help regarding these looming events. The use of lead is a recurring motif. The pipe they hammered was lead, the same material as the masks, suggesting they saw lead as useful, perhaps to contain explosions or shield against radiation. The fact that the lead masks were made just one day before their final journey, as Manuel's wife Nellie later confirmed to police. The men cut those eye mask pieces from a lead pipe at home on August 16th. Shows a continuity in their methods. They prepared specialized gear from available materials for each venture. The Autopsy explosion and other excursions also caught the attention of Brazil's intelligence agencies, simply because they involved unauthorized use of explosives and possibly unlicensed radio transmissions. It was discovered that prior to the beach test, Miguel had reached out to a local ham radio enthusiast, a man named Evaristo Fidelis de Moraes, who had a powerful transmitter near Autopsy. The Navy even reported that in the days leading up to the beach incident, they intercepted unusual radio communications in that area between call signs that were not officially registered. This raised eyebrows. Were Miguel and Manuel trying to communicate via radio to something or someone as part of their experiment? The call signs intercepted like CKJ21, did not match any licensed operator. The content of those transmissions remained unknown, but one could speculate that it might have been signals or coded messages potentially aimed at the sky, or simply clandestine coordination for their test. After recovering from any mishaps in June, the two friends continued to pursue their shared mission. They often met at Miguel's electronics shop after hours for lengthy sessions that mixed science and mysticism. They would dim the lights, perhaps turning the repair shop into a kind of impromptu laboratory temple. There, they, along with Elcio and occasionally their assistant Valder, engaged in spiritualist seance or meditative experiments. It was said that Elcio acted as a sort of medium during these gatherings. He would sometimes speak in different voices or personas, claiming to channel spirits, referring to himself as Dr. Paulo or Dr. Samuel, when purported entities spoke through him. Miguel and Manoel, though educated in electronics, were apparently captivated by these spiritual communications. Each had personal motivations too. Miguel suffered from chronic asthma, and Manuel had persistent abdominal pains. In that era, when modern medicine had its limits, the idea of spiritual healing or guidance was appealing. They sought counsel from Dr. Samuel for their ailments and life problems, believing, or at least hoping, that benevolent spirits could aid them. It's important to understand that in Brazil, this mixture of technology and spiritualism was not as far-fetched as it might sound. Spiritism, the doctrine codified by French educator Allan Kardec in the 19th century, had a massive following in Brazil. By the 1960s, there were thousands of spiritist centers across the country and millions of adherents. Spiritism taught communication with the spirits of the deceased, reincarnation, and also entertained ideas about life on other planets and the progress of souls in the universe. Many Brazilian spiritists prided themselves on calling their practice a science and a philosophy rather than a religion, emphasizing rational inquiry into paranormal phenomena. It wasn't unusual for engineers, doctors, and other professionals to be involved in spiritist societies. In fact, interest in paranormal research, telepathy, and psychic phenomena cut across social classes, even enjoying some academic interest under the label of parapsychology. In fact, the impulse to use technology to probe mystical questions had notable precedents. Decades earlier, famed inventor Thomas Edison speculated about constructing a device to communicate with the dead, reflecting the era's belief that science might one day bridge the gap to the spirit world. Throughout the early 20th century, scientists in Europe and America attended seances and conducted experiments to test psychic phenomena under controlled conditions. These efforts, though inconclusive, gave a sheen of credibility to pursuits that straddle the line between science and mysticism. Given this cultural backdrop, Manuel and Miguel's blending of scientific curiosity with spiritist belief wasn't unique, but the extent of their experiments certainly was extreme. They were, in effect, scientific spiritualists, a term that would later be used to describe them. They weren't content with attending a medium's meeting and passively listening. They wanted empirical proof or dramatic results, something tangible like lights in the sky or messages from beyond that could perhaps be recorded or directly observed. They studied technical manuals and spiritist literature side by side. In Miguel's home library, police found a book named Vida no Planeta Marta, Life on Planet Mars, by Herculio Mayas. This book, heavily annotated by the men, was a striking artifact of their mindset. Herculio Mayas claimed to have transcribed messages from a spirit called Ramadus, describing in detail the civilization of Mars, including its advanced spaceships, society, and the idea that souls could incarnate on different planets. Passages in this book spoke of intensely luminous spacecraft and beings, perhaps inspiring the notion that any encounter with such alien or spirit entities might involve blinding lights. Investigators noted that certain sections about the intense luminosity of Martian vehicles have been highlighted or marked. The lead mask on the hill suddenly made a kind of symbolic sense. If you expect to greet a radiant spacecraft or spiritual light beings, you might prepare protective goggles, even if improvised from the material you have. Such futuristic cosmic visions were not unique to these two Brazilians. They were part of a broader zeitgeist of the mid-20th century. Around the world, fascination with UFOs and extraterrestrials was on the rise. In the United States, for instance, self-proclaimed contactees like George Adamski had gained fame a decade earlier by claiming to meet friendly Venusians and Martians, spreading messages of universal peace and cosmic wisdom. These sensational stories, though scientifically dubious, were translated and circulated internationally, capturing imaginations in places as far away as Brazil. Meanwhile, the space race was underway, and ordinary people followed news of satellites and rockets, dreaming that humanity would soon reach the moon and beyond. In Brazil, belief in inhabited planets dovetailed neatly with spiritist philosophy. After all, if spirits populated the universe, why couldn't some of them reside on Mars or other worlds? Magazines and books speculated about alien visitors and psychic communications with the other planets. It was in this cultural atmosphere that Miguel and Manuel's aspirations flourished, encouraged by literature that treated interplanetary communication as both a spiritual quest and a scientific frontier. By August of 1966, it seems everything was converging for Manuel and Miguel. Their beliefs, experiments, and plans had led them to orchestrate a final definitive test. As Manuel hinted to his wife, he was about to go witness something that would make up his mind about what he believed. He likely anticipated either a triumphant contact or a disappointment. not death. Miguel appeared preoccupied and intense in those days, telling his sister that the moment he had spoken of had arrived. Both men approached what they were about to do with a blend of excitement and perhaps underlying anxiety, as evident by Manuel's initial sickness and Miguel's nervous clock watching at the bar. They even made sure to craft the lead mask the day before departure, cutting and hammering them to shape, evidence of how seriously they took this endeavor. They had gathered pills or capsules, from where is unknown. Possibly one of their circles knew a chemist or doctor, or they sourced something from a clandestine supplier. They drew up instructions and presumably briefed each other on the plan. It was like a checklist for a scientific experiment, but written in the language of laymen, dabbling in realms beyond their full comprehension. Chapter 7. Theories and Explanations. In the aftermath of the tragedy, a number of theories were considered, each attempting to explain the how and why of the lead mask case. With no conclusive forensic evidence to rely on, investigators and observers had to piece together narratives from the clues at hand in the cultural context. Over time, a few leading hypotheses emerged. 1. Accidental overdose during a spiritual experiment. This theory, which gradually became the most widely accepted, posits that Manuel and Miguel died during an accidental overdose of a drug or a combination of drugs taken voluntarily as part of their quest to contact otherworldly entities. All the evidence of their spiritualist and ufological interests supports this scenario. According to this idea, the men ingested a psychedelic or psychoactive substance at the hilltop, possibly something like LSD, which was just becoming known worldwide in the 1960s, or perhaps a strong tranquilizer or barbiturate that they believed could induce a trance-like state. Under the influence, or due to a miscalculated dose, they lost consciousness and their bodies shut down. The capsules mentioned in the note could certainly refer to doses of a drug. A local professor of yoga and spiritual practices told a newspaper at the time that indeed some spiritualist groups were experimenting with psychedelics to achieve altered states of consciousness, hoping to reach spirits or aliens through an expanded mind. This expert opined that Manuel and Miguel likely died from an accidental overdose, given that dosing such substances can be powerless without guidance. At the time, psychedelics themselves were a new and uncharted territory. Just a few years earlier, Harvard researcher turned prophet Timothy Leary had brought drugs like LSD into the public eye, touting them as gateways to profound spiritual insight. But proper knowledge about these substances was limited. If Manuel and Miguel obtained something purported to expand the mind, perhaps from a pharmacist friend or an underground source, they would not have truly known its potency or purity. A slight overdose of a powerful hallucinogen or a capsule laced with toxic impurity could have had lethal consequences. It's also possible that they used something more common, like a strong tranquilizer or sedative, mistaking in the belief that it would induce a visionary trance. Without a clear understanding or supervision, their well-intended experiment could very easily turn deadly. Supporting this theory are stories that later emerged from their circle of friends. It was claimed that the group of scientific spiritualists had indeed dabbled with psychedelic substances during some of their sessions, albeit in smaller amounts. If Manuel and Miguel escalated that practice on the hill, taking much stronger dose, it could explain their demise. It's worth noting, however, a puzzling aspect. LSD itself, for instance, is not known to cause direct lethal overdose, unlike, say, opiates or cyanide. This leaves open the possibility that the capsules contained something other than a classic hallucinogen. Lacking toxicology, we simply can't know. The accidental self-poisoning interpretation remains plausible, given the context, but it rests on educated conjecture. 2. Foul play, a deadly hoax or robbery. Another angle considered was that Manuel and Miguel might have fallen victim to a malicious trick or a planned crime. This theory suggests that an unknown third party, perhaps someone they encountered in a spiritist center, or an unscrupulous would-be guru, duped them into carrying out this bizarre ritual with the intention of robbing or murdering them. In essence, someone could have exploited the men's spiritual ambitions for nefarious ends. The scenario might have unfolded like this. A person whom the men trusted, maybe a charismatic guide figure, convinced them that on a certain day, they should perform a set of actions, taking capsules, wearing masks, going to that hill, to achieve enlightenment or alien contact. This same person provided the capsules, which were in fact poison. Once the men were incapacitated or dead, the culprit could have stolen the large sum of money they'd brought along. There is some circumstantial support for this. Recall the missing money. If unscrupulous individuals realized these two earnest, but perhaps naive technicians were wandering around with millions of cruceros looking to achieve a fantastical goal, they might have seen an easy target. Those 5 men reportedly seen by a witness with a jeep near the hill could fit into this narrative. Maybe a group of criminals tailing the victims. One known conman who became a suspect was the flamboyant figure Professor Alexander Augusto de Monteiro, Count Ramayana. He was known in occult circles and had a history of swindling people and involvement in paranormal-themed scams. It emerged that Ramayana had lived near Vintém Hill at one point and often hosted parapsychology gatherings. He was already wanted by police for other frauds. Notably, the mysterious monogrammed handkerchief found at the scene bore the initials AMS, which could match Alexander Monteiro Felva. By late 1968, police had traced Ramayana to northeastern Brazil, where he had been masquerading as a psychic professor. He evaded capture multiple times. In one colorful escape, he allegedly hid inside a refrigerator, but was eventually arrested in 1973. However, by then, years had passed, and there's no public record that he ever provided useful information regarding the lead mask case. The theory that Ramayana or someone like him staged a lethal hoax is tantalizing, but it lacks concrete proof. There were no signs of struggle on the hill, and the victims willingly ingested whatever killed them, suggesting if foul play was involved, it was through deception rather than force. 3. Espionage or illegal activities gone wrong. A less supernatural but initially plausible theory was that the lead mask mystery might have a connection to espionage, smuggling, or some clandestine operation. Essentially, that Manuel and Miguel were involved, perhaps unwittingly, in something illegal or covert, and died because of it. The reasoning behind this included the following points. They had technical expertise that could be valuable for surreptitious communications. They had coded notes, though those turned out to be innocuous. They were found in a remote area, as if meeting someone secretly. And there was that mention in the newspaper they carried about local smugglers at large. It was speculated that perhaps the two men were using their electronic know-how to operate an unauthorized radio transmitter for smugglers or spies. Maybe the experiments they talked about were a cover for clandestine work. If so, they could have been double-crossed by criminal partners who poisoned them to keep them quiet or take their money. However, as the investigation progressed, nothing concrete surfaced to tie them to a known criminal ring or spy network. The men's background and behavior didn't show any sign of being seasoned criminals or politically driven saboteurs. The contraband story seems to have been a red herring. No evidence was found linking those smugglers to the dead men on the hill. The espionage angle similarly fizzled. The military intelligence looked into the radio transmissions around Atafana, but that still pointed back to their UFO experiments rather than espionage. Thus, while the authorities had to consider this theory, especially in the Cold War context, it remains one of the more remote possibilities. 4. Contact with the unknown, UFO, or paranormal forces. Naturally, in a case so steeped in suggestion of the supernatural, some proposed that perhaps Manuel and Miguel really did encounter something beyond our current scientific understanding on that hill, and that this encounter is what led to their deaths. The fact that local newspapers soon printed witness accounts of a round orange UFO hovering over Vintém Hill on the night of August 17th added fuel to the extraterrestrial theory. According to this line of speculation, the two men succeeded in their goal of summoning or attracting an otherworldly entity, possibly a UFO or spirit manifestation, and it was the encounter itself that killed them. For instance, believers might imagine that an alien spacecraft came down and bombarded them with some form of radiation or gas, hence the need for masks and the traces of blood from internal injury, or that they were scared to death or otherwise overwhelmed by a powerful paranormal presence. Some fringe UFO researchers have pointed out the detail that the patch of ground where the bodies lay was allegedly barren for years after. Grass refused to grow there, according to Jacques Vallée's report in 1980. They interpreted this as a possible sign of radiation or some unknown energy having scorched the soil, consistent with a UFO landing or ray. However, this is anecdotal and possibly coincidental. Many factors can cause a bare patch of earth, from spilled chemicals to repeated foot traffic. By the time Valet visited, the site had seen multiple visits by police and curiosity seekers, who alone could inhibit planned growth. Another event cited by proponents of this theory is the earlier 1962 case mentioned by Charles Bowen of Flying Saucer Review. An electronic technician, not unlike Manuel and Miguel, supposedly found dead on a hill in Niterói with a lead mask nearby. If true, that is an eerie parallel, suggesting perhaps an ongoing pattern of fatal encounters with UFOs in the area. However, that 1962 story has never been verified through official records and seems to have been a rumor that surfaced only after the 1966 case made news. While the paranormal theory of the lead masks has its share of believers, it remains the least grounded in concrete evidence. It hinges on the assumption that whatever killed the men was not a drug or human act at all, but something beyond our realm. If one is inclined to believe this, the case takes on a truly chilling sci-fi character. Two men standing at a hilltop, beckoning the unknown, only to be struck down by it. Yet, for investigators trying to reach a practical conclusion, this theory was impossible to prove or act upon. It did, however, influence some later responses. For example, in the early 1970s, there were calls by a few officials and UFO enthusiasts to reopen the case in light of continued UFO sightings in the area, but these didn't gain official traction. 5. A misadventure in parapsychology. Another perspective frames the lead mask case as a cautionary tale of pseudoscience and spiritual exploration gone wrong. In this view, Manuel and Miguel might be seen as modern alchemists or amateur scientists of the occult who accidentally paid with their lives in an experiment aimed at proving parapsychological concepts. The official police report after the first investigation alluded to this. In 1967, when a second inquiry took place, the new lead detective consulted a prominent physician and psychologist, Dr. Silvio Lago, who prepared a treatise on parapsychology for the case. Dr. Lago's hypothesis was that the men had likely been trying to achieve some extraordinary psychic or out-of-body experience to prove the existence of the soul, or to communicate telepathically by inducing a state of semi-consciousness via chemical means. This aligns closely with Theory 1, but without emphasizing the UFO aspect. In essence, Dr. Lago concluded Miguel and Manuel paid with their lives for their inclination towards the supernatural and the marvelous. Whether there were any guilty third parties involved, he left that as an open question, suggesting that either the men alone were responsible, or if someone else set them up, that person might never be found by earthly justice. This interpretation sees the tragedy as stemming from the men's own beliefs and actions, a fatal self-experiment in the realm of the paranormal. It doesn't necessarily conflict with the overdose theory. It's more a philosophical framing of it. When the district attorney read the report that included these spiritual explanations, he was dissatisfied. In March 1967, He actually sent the case back to the police for further investigation, precisely because he felt an official report shouldn't hinge on supernatural speculations. It should identify concrete culpability or cause. That decision led to more investigation and exhumation in the round of false confessions and suspects discussed earlier. Yet by 1969, with no new results, the case was finally archived. In retrospect, this theory that the men were simply victims of their own quasi-scientific adventurousness remains perhaps the most coherent narrative. Two sincere but overzealous seekers pushed themselves into a lethal mistake. It encompasses the elements of psychedelic overdose, spiritualist context, and absence of an external perpetrator. Unfortunately, because of the lost evidence, it's a hypothesis that can't be conclusively proved either, leaving room for doubt and alternative theories to persist. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Legacy. As years turned to decades, the mystery of the lead mask case remained alive in Brazil's collective memory. In the immediate aftermath, it certainly captured national attention. The combination of science fiction-like elements, radiation-proof masks, coded messages, UFOs, with the grim reality of two dead husbands and fathers, made for compelling newspapers and magazine stories. Weekly magazines like O Cruzeiro and Manchete ran multi-page features with titles such as The Mystery of the Masked Dead and The Mystery of the Lead Masks, providing updates and speculation. Readers were treated to photographs of the hilltop scene, the evidence spread out for display, and interviews with the bewildered families. The case had everything: the unknown, tragedy, and a cautionary angle about dabbling in things beyond one's understanding. In the years that followed, sporadic developments rekindled interests briefly. In September 1968, 2 years after the incident, a photographer named Ari Pereira even claimed to capture an image of a flying saucer hovering above Vintém Hill in broad daylight. His photo, which showed a bright oval object against the sky, was published in newspapers, and he described how the object remained still for a few minutes before zipping away at high speed. This and other UFO reports kept the public aware that Vintém Hill had a strange aura about it. The aforementioned con man, Professor Ramayana, when he was finally captured in the early 1970s, only to escape again, then be recaptured in 1973, also brought the case back into the news. Police hinted they wanted to question him about the lead mask incident, among his many suspected misdeeds. However, no public closure came from that angle. In 1980, the mystery gained international attention when Jacques Vallée, a respected French-born computer scientist and ufologist, known for his work on the UFO phenomenon and as an inspiration for a character in Spielberg's Close Encounter of the Third Kind, traveled to Brazil to investigate. Vallée climbed Vintém Hill, spoke to some of the original investigators and reporters, and noted that the spot where the bodies had lain was still largely barren of vegetation, even 14 years later. He used the lead mask story as the prologue in his 1990 book, Confrontations, A Scientist's Search for Alien Contact. Vallée did not claim to have solved it, but he presented it to the world as an example of how human attempts to reach alien intelligence or enter other dimensions can sometimes end in tragedy and mystery. He viewed Manuel and Miguel with a degree of empathy. They were explorers of a sort who might have paid the price for venturing too far. Meanwhile, in Brazilian popular culture, the case retained its iconic status as one of the country's weirdest unsolved mysteries. It has been referenced in television programs and books about the paranormal. In 1990, a television docudrama series called Linha Direta, akin to Unsolved Mysteries, dramatized the lead mask story in one of its first episodes. This brought the tale to a new generation, portraying actors as Manuel and Miguel, retracing their final days and reenacting the hilltop scene, lead mask and all. The episode also interviewed some real people connected to the case. Later, in 2004, another program in the Linha Direta series revisited the mystery with updated perspectives and any information that had trickled out over the decades. Both times, audiences were left as confounded as ever, but thoroughly engrossed by the story. Over time, the phrase Caso das Máscaras de Chumbo, lead mask case in Brazil, came to stand for any confounding, outlandish mystery. It remains one of the country's most enduring unsolved cases, often mentioned in the same breath as other famous unsolved mysteries around the world that blend crime with the uncanny. Each retelling in media tends to highlight different facets. Some lean into the UFO angle and the idea of alien contact, while others focused on the crime mystery aspect, the missing money, the possibility of a third-party culprit, and still, others frame it as a psychological drama of delusion and experiment. One thing that nearly all commentators agree on is the sense of tragedy and caution that pervades the story. Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana were, by all accounts, intelligent, well-intentioned men. They were not insane. They were not lifelong mystics withdrawing from reality. They were practical electronics experts with families, but they nurtured a grand curiosity about metaphysical questions. In chasing those answers, with the limited tools and knowledge at their disposal, they took a leap of faith, and that leap proved fatal. Their story is often cited as warning about the dangers of amateur experimentation with drugs or the occult. It underscores how even educated individuals can be swept up in unorthodox beliefs, and without the tempering influence of skepticism or external oversight, can make disastrous choices. For the families they left behind, the lack of closure was painful. Miguel's sister Isabel, who had sensed her brother was up to something extraordinary in the days before he left, was left only with fragments of his cryptic remarks and the unanswerable question of why. Manuel's wife, Nellie, had to grapple not just with sudden widowhood and raising their children alone, But with the perplexity of her husband's intentions, he woke her to say goodbye and hinted at an experiment, then never returned. One can only imagine the guilt and second-guessing that haunted their friend Elcio Gomez. Elcio, by some accounts, might have been the one who introduced them to many of the spiritual ideas that set them on that path. He was interrogated, even jailed briefly, but ultimately cleared. Elcio always maintained he truly believed the pair were going to Sao Paulo and that he had no hand in what happened. He lived under the shadow of the case for a long time, a figure of local suspicion or curiosity. In Campos dos Goitacazes, Manuel and Miguel were buried in the local cemetery, and life slowly moved on. The era of the late 1960s gave way to the 1970s. Man did land on the moon in 1969, showing that reaching other worlds was at least physically possible. Perhaps if Manuel and Miguel had waited a few years, they would have seen the first photographs of Mars' surface from NASA's Mariner probes in 1965 and 1969 and readjusted their expectations of what life on Mars might be. But those are what-ifs. Their small electronics shop, once filled with the buzz of soldering iron and the hopeful discussions of cosmic wonders, eventually shuttered. Campos continued to be a hub of commerce and industry, and Niterói's Vintém Hill returned to quiet obscurity, known mainly among locals and mystery aficionados as a place of a bygone unsolved riddle. Conclusion. Late on that August afternoon in 1966, two men climbed a hill in hopes of witnessing a marvel. In their pockets, they carried a handwritten guide to a miracle that science had not sanctioned, but their hearts believed possible. They prepared with ritual carefulness, donning new raincoats against the drizzle, laying down palm leaves as if to sanctify the ground, removing their watches and rings as if to shield those metals from mystical harm, and finally covering their eyes with solid lead to block out the glare of whatever enlightenment might come. They looked for all the world like pilgrims, dressed in their Sunday best for a meeting with the unknown. We can imagine the silence that fell on Vintém Hill as twilight turned to night. Perhaps one of them hesitated as the time came to consume the mysterious capsules, but seeing the resolve in his friend's eyes, he followed through. For years, they had chased mysteries together, repairing televisions by day and exploring invisible realms by night. And now, this was the culmination of their journey. They swallowed the pills with cold mineral water and waited. Did their surroundings start to spin? Did the clouds part to reveal a brilliant light? Or did only darkness envelop them as whatever they ingested took effect? At some point, perhaps they laid back, side by side, on the palm leaves, gazing, if they could see at all through those laden masks, at the clouded sky, hoping for a sign. Above them, maybe the orange glow of that supposed UFO did appear, or maybe it was only in their imaginations. If a signal came, neither man was in a state to respond to it. Instead, their breathing shallowed, their pulses slowed, and in that lonely clearing, consciousness slipped away from both of them. The heavens did not open. No ascendant beings arrived. Just the quiet night and the ceaseless chorus of crickets and two still forms hidden on the hilltop. Days later, the world learned of their fate and has been struggling to comprehend it ever since. The lead mask they left behind became symbols of the inexplicable. In a sense, those dull gray pieces of metal symbolized the thin shield between mortal humans and the blinding truth they sought. The men behind them remain forever frozen in time as earnest seekers who met a baffling end. What exactly Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz encountered, whether it was a lethal miscalculation of chemistry, a fraudster's deadly trap, or something phenomenally strange, remains even after all this time unresolved. The story of the lead mask of Vintém Hill endures not because anybody expects a sudden revelation, but because it speaks to deeper enigmas of the human condition. Our longing for knowledge beyond our reach, the interplay of faith and reason, and the haunting consequences that can arise when we venture into uncharted realms. In the end, we may never find out with certainty what these two friends truly experienced in their final hours. The hill keeps its secrets, and the case has slipped into that realm of history where it lives on as legend rather than active investigation. Yet, their tale continues to captivate and puzzle, a definitive modern enigma. It invites each new generation of curious minds to re-examine the clues and imagine their own explanations. And perhaps that is fitting. In a world where so much can be explained, a mystery like the lead mask case reminds us that there are still questions that defy answers, still horizons beyond the reach of our flickering torchlight of understanding. Once someone hears the full story of Manuel and Miguel and their fateful journey of Vintém Hill, all the background, context, and theories, they may come away not with a neat conclusion, but with a feeling of wonder and humility. The lead mask case, in all its strangeness, ultimately leaves us with a sense of awe at the capacity of humans to dream beyond their limits and the enduring allure of the unknown.